many are still grieving. Some families will be lost to one another forever. To those of you who face the difficulties of reconnecting with family and establishing ongoing relationships, we say sorry. We offer this apology in the hope that it will assist your healing and in order to shine a light on a dark period of our nation's history. To those who have fought for the truth to be heard, we hear you now.
You're listening to Adopt Perspective Podcast, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption. I'm your host and president of Jigsaw Queensland, Jo Sparrow. This podcast is a production of Jigsaw Queensland Post-Adoption Support Service. However, the views expressed are those of the people participating and not necessarily Jigsaw Queensland. The podcast discusses adult themes and listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Adopt Perspective. I'm your host and president of Jigsaw Queensland, Jo Sparrow. Today we're joined by a very special guest, someone that many of you will be familiar with, Paul Sunderland. Paul is a leading addiction specialist, psychotherapist, and speaker with more than 35 years of experience, whose groundbreaking work often explores the overlooked connections between adoption, trauma, and addiction. His insightful presentations, including his talks about adoption, addiction, and healing from adoption trauma and complex PTSD, were published on YouTube for LifeWorks and the Adult Adoptee Movement, and they've gone viral in the adoption community. In today's episode, we'll be delving into the unique challenges of adoption, exploring how early separation from our mothers can impact identity and mental health, and examining why adopted people may be more vulnerable to addiction. We hope this episode reaches not just adopted people, but also parents of lost to adoption, adoptive parents, therapeutic professionals, and anyone working in or connected to this space. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Paul Sunderland. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's really nice to be here, Jo, and I've enjoyed getting to know you, and I love talking about this stuff. It's sort of co-creative for me and helps us think together about something that's so important.
Thanks, Paul. So could you start by sharing a bit about your background and how you became interested in exploring the intersection of adoption and addiction?
Okay, so this is probably a big question, and I'm one of those people that can just carry on and in my answer, so I'll get carried away. So please feel free to just bring me back. I trained. I was interested in addiction. Actually, my personal story is that I was a lost boy. I was a heroin addict who did rehab in my early 20s, and I trained my second career, having got into what you call recovery. I'm not an adopted person. I used to do some volunteer work in a prison for young offenders, and actually a prison quite near the Heathrow Airport in London. So where people, if you've been caught bringing drugs into the UK, that's where you went. And we had a class with sort of woodwork next door, and I think English is a foreign language the other side. And we did a sort of drug awareness class. And I realized I was more interested in, I felt more alive coming back on the train then than I did doing my other job, which was fairly glamorous actually, but nevertheless, I enjoyed it more. And I decided to train as an addictions counselor in my 20s. I then trained as psychotherapist at the Institute of Psychiatry at one of the London med schools. And I studied psychology. I don't belong to any particular institute anymore. I think possibly for two reasons. One, I think my sort of character is I'm not really a belonger. Somehow I think creativity is on the edge. And also because actually the field of psychotherapy is a very insecure one. There's lots of different institutions who've got different ideas about what happens, and I'm always interested in what someone else is doing, that sort of thing. But when I worked in addiction, I worked in a hospital, so an addiction-focused hospital, 36-bed hospital for quite a long time, and I did my training, and I was there for a very long time because I went from being a trainee to being a clinical director ultimately, until I left in 1999, and actually then went to work on the other side of the Atlantic. But when you work in addiction, an awful lot of people are also in recovery from addictions. It's almost a sort of thing. It's like otherwise you might not even think about doing it. You might in a flower shop or something like that. But and I've talked about this before. There's what I really noticed was there were several members of staff who were adopted, and I remember thinking, this is a bit weird. Do you know, I've been around this sort of thing before. What's that about? But nobody was talking about it. And when we did histories, no one was saying, and I don't, you take a social history, but I don't think anybody was really interested in what happened at birth or in early years or indeed before birth. And it was only really when I was in private practice, working in addiction, had become, and working also as a psychotherapist, and we're getting people coming along with what I suppose in a way we call love addiction, although that's not a recognized classification. People understand that. It's about a hunger for attachment, essentially. And there were quite a few people who you take a history and they'd say at the end, and by the way, I was adopted. And you start to think, oh, wait a minute, I think there's a connection between what happened at the, I mean, it's obvious in a way now, isn't it? You look back and you see this stuff. There's a connection between what happened at the beginning of life and the difficulties that we get into, today, that our brains are still operating on old information and in a sense, rightly. But if that information is traumatic, then it's going to operate in a traumatic way. So I think that's part of it. I will finish this question in a second, but I also became really interested in, so why do some people who want to get well, and others who want to get well don't? And I realized that the received wisdom when I started training in the 80s was addiction was a standalone disease. No one thought you would just catch it like you might catch COVID or something. But nobody really, I think the fear was that victims don't recover. So you don't look at the past, you take responsibility today. It's a bit binary, and we'll probably talk about all of that. But the truth is that there are certain groups of people who really struggle to get well, and there are groups of people who are overrepresented. And there were two things that I recognized working in hospital settings. There were two groups that were really overrepresented. One was adoptees, and of course they are overrepresented in mental health. The other, actually, working in the UK, we have this very peculiar habit of outsourcing education and indeed childcare. The middle classes do, to sending children to boarding school. And there was an awful lot of people who'd been sent away to boarding school age 7 or 8. I think we've got to start thinking about that. And also understanding that recovery from addiction isn't just about abstinence, that addiction is pumping iron. And if you stop addiction in one area, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, addiction is a disease that migrates and will show up somewhere else. So at some point, you need to be thinking, what happened before? What is it that made an addiction an adaptive response? Why did addiction make sense for these people? Anyway,
It's
long answer.
fascinating. I'm
Long
glad you
answer.
gave
Sorry
me the
about that.
long version. That was good. So, your
Sorry.
presentations that you've done on adoption, trauma, and addiction have really resonated for so many people in our community. Are you aware of the significant reach and impact they've had? Like on YouTube alone, these talks have had over 182,000 views. That's when I last looked. So, it's probably more than that now. And what kind of feedback have you received from the adoption community?
Well, I'm always slightly embarrassed about it because it just feels like I'm just a guy who's trying to make sense of things. And it's a bit like you said at the beginning, if you've got Paul's got 35 years of experience, and some people, I do a lot of presentations and people tend to read CVs out, don't they, when they introduce you. But I often think the best introduction is, Paul's been hanging around trying to work out what on earth is going on, and it's probably over 35 years. It comes a point, doesn't it, where you have a certain amount of years and it gives you kudos. After a while, somebody says, don't you think it's time you retired? If you get 40 years. But the answer to your question, is that actually you mentioned it when we were having a chat the other day about the numbers. I think, gosh, you'll have a look. And it's just that is, occasionally one does. I'm as vain as anyone else, but I don't spend a lot of time looking at the stats. And this is just one area of what I do. Um, so I am aware, but I also get an awful lot of email. I'm quite hard to get hold of, and we don't really have a website, or I don't have one. And so, but I do get a lot of email, and people are really generous with their information. And the difficulty we've got to now is that there just isn't enough time to reply.
Mm.
And I'm really moved to be trusted. And people often say, "Gosh, this really made sense to me." And of course, what hurts well, hurts, but touches you is you're often talking about people in the second half of their lives who are
Mm.
saying, "Gosh, this makes a sense. Why have I had to wait so long?"
Mm.
And so start to have a feeling of responsibility for that. I mean, very occasionally, not actually directly, somebody makes some comment on a talk that I've done that usually, as people do, says, "This man's full of shit," usually is what it says. But that's very rare.
I'm glad that's rare.
And occasionally and people say some things that are quite challenging, particularly around the politics, because I'm afraid I came into this with thinking about the impact on the nervous system. I believed naively that adoption I believe the received wisdom. There's a triad. There's an adoptee, there's a birth parent, there's an adopted parent. I don't think I fully understood actually the impact on society, which is, I mean, and particularly in the UK, over 200,000 mothers had their children forcibly taken from them right up until the 1970s. It's just like, what? But actually, we've covered this. So much was covered up. Um, and actually, I've had quite a bit of challenge about, why are you saying relinquished? And and the reason is I'm talking about the impact on the nervous system, but actually, of course, there's so much politics, and there are people you know, who are literally trafficked, bought, sold, stolen. There's so much stuff around all of this. So I am aware of the impact, and I like the fact that people do communicate because there's a co-creation. I learn an awful lot from the experts with lived experience.
Yeah. So you've spoken about adopted people often displaying symptoms associated with complex PTSD. Could you
Mhm.
explain to us what PTSD and complex PTSD are and how the experience of separation and adoption can result in this kind of trauma?
Okay,
It's a
it's a
big
big
question.
question.
Yeah.
Big question. At first, I think the first thing to say is psychiatric diagnoses are very different from physiological sort of diagnoses. Psychiatric diagnoses are based on clusters of symptoms, observations, reports. They're not based on biomarkers. We're not looking at a rash, we're not doing a blood test, we're not doing a brain scan. It's more about, okay, there's a cluster of symptoms these people have, and we give them labels.
Mm.
And so what also happens is a lot of these labels develop over time. So PTSD, in World War One was shell shock. This stuff develops. There's more and more interest in it after the Vietnam War, mostly because the Americans had a lot of, veterans coming back, and it was really sort of problematic. Some of whom had substance abuse issues too as a result of all of that. Judith Herman, a marvelous lady, wrote it was responsible for coining the term complex PTSD in the 90s. Dr. Judith Herman, and she, she was thinking about actually, look, PTSD, there are some differences, all traumas have some things in common. And in fact, what's worth knowing is that all traumas have a sense of captivity and a feeling of powerlessness in common. So pretty much whatever happens, whether you're abused, you're in an accident, a natural disaster, a war zone, there's a feeling of I can't get out of here and I'm powerless. And we start to talk about recovery involving voice and choice. I like these little things because people remember them when they write and things like that. So I talk a lot to people about, voice and choice. Um, but essentially, post-traumatic stress disorder is when the brain believes that the traumas of the past are still happening or around the next corner. It involves a hypervigilance. It could happen again. PTSD tends to be single incident, although I think if you're in a war zone, you'd probably claim it wasn't a single incident. It went on for a while.
Mhm.
But complex PTSD is about something that is essentially it's about chronic trauma, often many traumas, and I think for people who have been adopted and have had the wound of separation, um, and often multiple separations. We're talking about chronic trauma in so many different ways over time. So complex PTSD tends to be chronic, enduring, childhood, developmental.
That's great.
That's actually the short answer.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
we can talk
that's
about
great.
the simple symptoms.
Yeah. No, that's really good. You really simplified something that's incredibly complex. So thank you. So you've discussed the concept of the primal wound and how early loss can impact the brain. How does
Mm,
this make adopted people more susceptible to addiction?
okay. God, I love these questions posed in so few words. It's just enormously complicated. Um, Uh, Well, I mean, there's so many things about w- we are born with. I don't know how they know this, but it's something like people talk about 86 billion neurons, somewhere between 86. Why they say 86 or 85 billion, I don't know. But we're born with all these neurons, and what happens to us over the period of development is those neurons try and join up together and make sense of the world. So that's one of the things that happens, and it particularly happens in the first sort of 7 or so years of life,
Mm,
which is why I think the Jesuits used to say, "Give me a child till they're 7, and I'll
yeah.
make them man," it's something like that.
I
Uh,
have seen the documentary, yes.
okay, so there's a lot of truth in that. Those early experiences form the foundations. They're the architect of the brain, but actually they're the architect of the nervous system, and that's the key thing. So, there is some stuff about early life adversity. There's quite a lot of research. So, the amygdala develops sometime before the hippocampus. The amygdala is our sort of early warning system, as you know. It's the smoke detector, what's safe and what isn't safe. The hippocampus, which actually is more responsible for mediating time and when things happen, develops much later. So, particularly if you've got early life adversity, it's quite hard to actually say, well, that was then and this is now.
Yeah.
So that's one of the problems. Then, if it happens now, and I often talk about this and give examples. I'm afraid it's rather a British example. I was talking about one of the motorways that surrounds London. But, if you have a terrible car accident, you will remember a time you could drive a car. You might not want to go anywhere near where you had the accident. You may feel a bit iffy about it, but you did know that you did. But for brain development, there are these three things, and the word primal actually, Nancy Verrier's, it's a term that's been used in psychology before, but it was a great title, I think, for Nancy Verrier's book, The Primal Wound. Um, because it's primal in the sense that there is no pre-trauma personality. I often talk about that, which is why so many people with these difficulties tend to think, well, it's just me rather than it's something that happened to me. We're talking about people who are lost in transition, I think, to play on the film, lost in transition because there was nothing before. There's no pre-trauma personality yet. There's this enormous wound that probably starts happening in the third trimester anyway, of pregnancy in terms of being felt, in terms of what's gonna happen next. So we got a trauma, there's no pre-trauma personality and it can't be recalled. It is remembered, but it can't be recalled. And so we tend to talk about, the issues are in the tissues. It's felt rather than thought about.
I love that. The issues are in the tissues. I have to remember that one. So, how can early trauma, including the trauma of separation in adoption, shape a person's coping mechanisms to manage overwhelming emotions throughout their life? Could you talk about the types of self soothing patterns people develop when they have a trauma history, starting in childhood and continuing into adulthood?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know if I've given it enough thought. But basically, I mean, if you are adopted, it is highly likely, in the majority of cases, you are there because someone else isn't. Somewhere, somebody has been unable to live without a child. What isn't talked about is felt. That's the problem, really. It's the same thing with transgenerational trauma. What isn't talked about is felt. If it's not talked about, it's not processed. So we're talking about people who have a real sense of like there's something not right here that absolutely isn't talked about. And the reason I'm just saying this bit in response to your question is that really gets in the way of what we call co-regulation.
Hmm.
Co-regulation is that development, that co-created between two people, but at the beginning of life tends to be mother and baby, that co-created sense of safety and belonging, a genuine full-on welcome. I mean, as it were, and you belong. And when you start treating people, and particularly people with addiction, one of the things you hear very often a few months in, particularly if you're doing group therapies or people are getting well within group situations, which are massively co-regulating, is nearly everybody ends up saying, "God, I really feel like I belong here." Do you know? And you think if you have to remark on that, that says something about how you felt before, don't you think?
Yeah. Yeah.
I did not. So, anyway, but to answering your question, if you miss out on co-regulation, you are left with only one form of regulation or attempt at self-regulation. And we can talk about this later because self-regulation without co-regulation actually is survival.
Mm.
Self-regulation with co-regulation is self-care. It's a very, very important point, and I'm very keen. Co-regulation, one of my favorite words in the clinic, basically. Such an important thing. But we're talking about people who feel somehow their nervous systems feel they're not on the same planet as their caregivers. So they are trying to self-regulate, and that becomes, so your question is about self-soothing. What can you do to self-soothe? Anxious children bite nails, suck thumbs, rock, tend to sort of freeze a lot because you can't fight and flight, that's for sure, and you can't really engage and negotiate. So there's an awful lot of freezing, which has an incredible impact actually. Then nearly all people with early psychological wounds have gastrointestinal issues because almost the whole system freezes. And you hear about IBS, because the baby's world is all about poo and vomit wind.
Yeah.
Do you know, that's where it all goes. But so you've got some classics, some sort of thumb sucking, sort of soothing. Later, you get an awful lot of sort of genital soothing, boys and girls. Awful shame about all of that. Awful shame, sad, because nobody understands why. And of course, again, it's something that is maybe less so now, but in general is shamed. Um, so it's that sort of stuff with other forms of soothing. I mean, it's quite a high incidence of stealing amongst adoptees. And I think that's quite interesting. Of course, they get terribly told off, as children maybe might do, but it tends to not be understood. I think it's quite interesting because I suspect, in a way, children are, when there's, we're talking about people who felt stolen
Yeah.
in their captivity and their powerlessness. And of course, it's so there's something powerful. When you feel powerless, you try and do something that's powerful. I'm gonna take this, you know. It's that sort of thing. You probably think, I don't know, if you've got some ideas or other things that come to mind for you.
Oh, I'm just really, it's actually just resonating so deeply with me because I remember listening to one of your talks where you spoke about exactly this and the different types of self-soothing that adopted people they might do. And I remember just thinking back to my own childhood and all of these little things that I did that, sometimes I had shame around, and that nobody put the pieces together. Like, it was never anything, no one ever put the pieces together that Joanne might be struggling. So I'm
Yeah.
just thinking to myself how many people might be listening and just going, wow, that just really describes what my childhood was like. So I think I'm just very moved listening to it actually, and just how helpful
Okay.
this would have been
Thanks.
for so many people to know about when we were younger. Yeah.
Yeah, no, well, thanks for sharing that because it's the beginning of a shame, an awful shame. And of course, shame is the feeling there's something wrong with me. I'm not good enough, you
Yeah.
know, when actually the real shame is that the caregivers, um, you know, can't see, don't know, can't explain. And I'm not meaning to make them all bad in any way. There's so much that we used to do as human beings that we don't do anymore. That was quite common, and quite rightly we don't do it anymore. But that it needs to change because shame is a defense. Something's wrong with me for the human infant is a defense against there's something wrong with this picture. There's
Mm.
something wrong with them. But for the human infant to actually consider there's something wrong with their caregivers is life-threatening in itself because you're left with, well, how will I survive?
Yeah.
The human infant. I mean, two things very interesting about children. One is to have a real sense of fairness very early on. Anyone who's got children will know that it's not fair. It's quite, that there's something not right. The trouble is, we're talking about a group of people who daren't say it's not fair. Yeah. So, that stuff is there. But the other thing is the human infant knows without care they'll die. It's
Yeah.
instinctive. So there's all that sort of fitting in. We'll probably think of other. It's a great question about the soothing because it's the beginning of a process of self-regulation which is one of the susceptibilities to addiction, because
Mm.
we're talking about people whose nervous systems have lost faith in human beings to regulate their emotion.
Mm.
So it makes a sense to put your faith somewhere else, and until it doesn't.
Yeah.
That's the problem. But
Yeah.
by the time it doesn't, we're into the symptoms of addiction.
Yeah. And because there was no space for, adoption to be thought of as a loss, in our childhoods, I think
Mm.
we also are so protective of our experiences of childhood. Look, I've heard so many adopted people stories now. I share
Yeah,
them
too.
sometimes in a public space like the podcast, sometimes in a private space. And something that becomes clear to me so often is that in the public space, they tell me this much about their story of adoption with their parents, and then once the microphone is turned off, or we're in a slightly safer space and they feel more comfortable with me, then some more reality comes out about how uncomfortable or traumatic their childhoods were. But they
Mm.
still feel publicly the need to protect that, whether it's for fear of
Yeah,
rejected or just, the stigma that's around saying you're anything but grateful for your experience. So,
yeah,
yeah.
happens. I think it's also a very human thing to protect parents and kin.
Mm,
This, I think, probably biologically motivated towards that. Um,
yeah.
you know, we don't like, we might take a dim view of our parents, but we don't want anyone else announcing that dim view, for
Yeah.
example.
So when people think of addiction, they often think of drugs and alcohol. What other
Yeah.
types of addiction, you did touch on this earlier, but what other types of addiction can emerge, particularly for adopted people struggling with unresolved trauma?
Okay, well, I mean, certainly sort of addictional came out of thinking about it, and the treatment and study of addiction came out of actually addiction to alcohol, and then people realized, and everyone thought, well, maybe alcohol was the problem, and then people realized, no, actually, the problem is within the person. It's the interaction between alcohol as a drug, and then it becomes people realize that. Actually, alcohol is a drug. The problem is the interaction between a certain person's nervous system and a mood altering chemical. And we find that. So addiction migrates just chemically. We used to treat heroin addicts who would come back, they might represent 5 years later as alcoholics who actually had no real taste for alcohol when they were taking heroin, for example. Um, but so we talk about the chemical addictions, but we talk about what's now called process addictions, which are, in a sense, the overuse or indeed the restriction of things that actually we need as human beings. So there's a very good argument that we don't need mood altering chemicals. But I'm not against all of that because there's a whole cluster of people who have a lot of fun, and a lot of soothing, and it's social and all of that. Although, clearly there are nowadays there are mood altering chemicals are so powerful they're going to hijack your functioning and the
Yeah.
communities if you're not careful. But so we think about the need for sex, for example. So people develop a sex addiction. We talk about the need for love and relationship, so-called love addiction, so-called codependency. There are areas around money and spending, a sort of compulsive wanting, if you like, certainly around food. Addictions around food, addictions around busyness. It tends to be called workaholism, but that's yeah, people think of workaholism being a badge of honor. Workaholics that can't stop being busy. That's the truth. There's so around sort of adrenaline, if you like. There are those issues. But I think the other thing to think about with addiction is that addiction, because actually addictions are, everybody's heard of fight and flight and freeze, and we add the fourth F, because again, I like these simple things, which is called fawn. Basically, most addictions are either a flight or a freeze. So addictions manifest in two ways. One is I can't get enough of what I don't need, hunger for it. The other is I'm going to restrict my need because then I won't be in pain.
Mm.
Which we would think of as an anorexia. So we think about food, which is an easy one, and everyone thinks of anorexia being around a restriction around food. There are compulsive overeaters. Somehow I regulate my mood by eating, and it makes a sense. When we are eating, if we are chewing, we're sending a message to the nervous system that, well, we're not under attack, so we're having a meal. Yeah. When does anyone under attack have a meal? Do you know, it is calming.
Yeah.
And so it's an attempt, but of course you never get enough because you're trying to get today what, with complex PTSD, what actually you needed a long time ago. But the brain can't really separate the fact that, this is now, and that whole the hippocampal timeline stuff. But we've also got to then think about the other side of compulsive overeating. It might be, an anorexia, which is, actually, if I restrict my need, then I can't get hurt.
Mhm.
Now, what we find, or if I can just get it perfectly right, which is the orthorexia from the Greek, ortho meaning right. If I can just get what I eat right, then I will be okay and survive and survive. So the anorexia, if you like, is seen as a freeze. The it's not quite as simple as I'm saying it. So maybe we should just focus on every addiction has a sort of I can't get enough or I'm going to restrict. The
Mm.
same with love or sex. There are people like I cannot get enough of this, and that's part of the markers. We talk about a preoccupation, a loss of control, a sense of withdrawal when you stop, an inability to unsuccessful attempts at control, continuing to do something despite harmful consequences. But you also get people who are sexually anorexic. I'm just going to absolutely avoid it. I'm not going to allow myself that very human need for skin on skin or the oxytocin that comes from, being at one with with another. Financially, people have, if only I can just, if I can just get this, then everything will be okay. It
Mm.
might cost me ages and it'll be on a payment plan and I'll forget the fact that I probably would have paid 20% more by the time I paid them back, but I've got to have it now. Or I'm not going to need anything. I'm going to be needless and wordless. But both of these end up being addictions.
So, you mentioned in your answer codependency. So, what can you tell us about codependency and adoption?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think all addicts behind all addictions is a codependency. But codependency, again, this is not in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, of the American Psychiatric Association. It's not in the ICD, International Classification of Diseases. Codependency is a term that makes so much sense to so many people. But it's not actually an official sort of thing. Again, it's based on clusters of symptoms.
Mm.
But codependency is the management of anxiety through relationships, if you like, with other people, how I manage my anxiety when I'm with you. And typically, codependency is probably what people used to call sort of people pleasing. It's about, and we call it the fourth F, the fawn response. It's a faux engagement. It's an aligning and appeasing. I will keep myself safe by putting you at ease. Actually, one of the people who didn't coin the term, but Pierre Melody wrote a book about codependency in the 80s. It's quite famous. Actually, I think we've moved on a lot from that. And she died about 6 weeks ago. And a great contribution is, and actually, I mean, to this field, interestingly, I think to the sort of relational psychology field um, and complex PTSD. Uh, um, Women are far more overrepresented in their contributions, actually. This is really interesting. But I say that because Pia Melody, I've been reminded because she died, and I remember she said to me, codependency is like, you need to think about it, Paul. These people are setting themselves on fire to keep someone else warm. And I mean, it's a bit extreme, but I was like, anyway, in honor of her, because she, who died this year, I just think that's at its extreme. I will subordinate my needs to keep myself safe as long as you're safe. And it's a fawn response.
Mm.
Now, again, for adoptees, which is why we're talking about this particularly, it's a bit like, the human infant. Well, as in anybody, you walk into a room, well, how do you have to be here? What do you have to do to fit in? But we're talking about people, what do you have to do to survive? This is
Yeah.
about survival. Without care, I will die. I don't have choices. I can't fight this. I can't say, oh, by the way, I'm going to pack my bag. I'm going back or I'm going somewhere else. Do you know,
Yeah.
there's very little. You've got a freeze response and then you've got a bit of a fawn. I'll fit in. And somehow, if I keep everybody happy, then, I'll be safe and secure. And what's more, if I don't keep them happy, I might get given up again. Now,
Mhm.
none of this is really thought about. These are what we call unthought knowns. They're below consciousness. They're known, but they are thought, and they're part of our sort of driving system. So,
Yeah.
again, we're talking about people, people that are adopted and of course, it's not just adoption. It's not just a sort of, the nervous system doesn't feel I've been relinquished, even if, because it can't, the nervous system for an infant can't say I've been stolen or forcibly taken or sold or trafficked. I mean, it just can't do that. The experience for the nervous system, I've been given up, which means that that's the trauma. Then I could be given up again. So what do you have to do to fit in? And the feeling is, look, I think we're on different planets here. I've got this experience. Nobody's validating it. I must be wrong. Let's keep people happy. Now,
Yeah.
there is another codependence. So that codependence is in a way, is the fawn response. The other codependence is the fight response that most codependents don't like admitting that they've got. And by the way, we all have a bit of, of course, we're all going to be polite and open doors and say please and thank you and put people at ease. So I'm not pathologizing this, but I'm talking about people who, if you have complex PTSD, you live in a hypervigilance. The problem is that this response doesn't get turned off. A nice response, you and I met, a couple of months ago, and we were quite polite to each other, and that's part of how we regulate it. But, we're talking about people who can't stop doing that, even if we had some major disagreement, which, you and I have yet to have, Joe, but there was, do you know, it's just like
Let's
they
not
can't
have
really,
one.
but they can't really resolve this stuff. We're talking about people whose nervous systems, the stress response is locked in the on position, and that's the problem. Because when you're hypervigilant, you can't be present. If you can't be present, you can't be engaged. You can't be yourself. You lose spontaneity, and anything that comes at you left field gives you a startle response.
Mm.
But the other codependence is the fight one. And that is people who manage their anxiety by putting the other person at dis-ease. And actually, and very often codependents end up in relationships. Fawn types end up in relationships with fight types. So the fawn type, if you do couple therapy, will be saying, I just can't get it right for him or her. Whatever I do, I can't get it right. And the fight type is, they can't get it right for me because they never will. I feel okay by making you the problem. You will be the explanation of my difficulties.
Mm.
And it's very difficult without explanation and help for people's nervous systems to do that. But
Yeah.
that's the codependence. It's not safe. I can't. The opposite of codependence is, in a sense, is co-regulation or co-creation, if you like. But we're talking about people who can't do that because all the time. You know, for people with early wounds, psychological wounds, I mean, people are exhausting.
Mm.
Their batteries, you know, I observe these people, their batteries get drained very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just thinking too about, and it probably leans more into identity, but how to remain in the family and to be safe, not to be given away, even if the family's not that safe. Adoptees who already struggle with identity because we're not mirrored or anything in our
Yeah,
families often
yeah.
mask because it's not safe to come out and sort of show how you're feeling about it, anything, even if you don't know what you're feeling. So we're often masking and, choking ourselves, I guess, by not being able to say what we're feeling, which is very hard when you're trying to build identity.
Oh, absolutely. No, well, you've put that very well. Because everything comes second, the building of identity and who am I and what do I really like?
Mhm.
You know, right down to, how do I like to dress? What music do I like? You know, what's my favorite dot dot dot. All of that comes second to survival.
Yeah. So, on that note, can you speak to the long-term impacts of adoption trauma on identity, self-worth, and emotional regulation?
Well, identity is an interesting one because, of course, I mean, every person who's been adopted has a a different experience. And there are some very complicated ones in terms of transracial adoptions, and very often the people have been trafficked and sold. You know, where the children are treated like, well, the objects that can be owned, if you like. And that has, there's a loss of culture, religion, nationality. Very often, if you come from one country to another, you lose your right to have a passport for the country that you were born in. Do you
Mhm.
know, these things are awful. And you end up feeling like, well, where do I? So there's a real, well, where do I belong? Because the truth is, whatever anyone says, it's the nervous system at the end of the day decides about belonging, not what somebody says to you. It's what you experience. So there are issues. I'm slightly losing. You may have to repeat your question, but uh, but in terms of, do you mind repeating it? I'm sorry
Yeah,
to do
the
that.
long-term impacts of adoption on identity, self-worth, and emotional regulation.
Okay, so I was addressing identity really then,
Yeah.
in terms I've lost my culture, my language, my religion, and it's a sort of this, it's like a sort of forced assimilation really, and all of that. The impact on regulation is that, if you don't develop faith in human beings to regulate your mood, you are going to fall back on self-regulation. And that is going to be in the interests of survival and
Mhm.
is likely to be addictive in some ways. It's a belief, if you like, it becomes a sort of compulsive, a belief in if only I can be self-reliant. So it becomes almost like a compulsive self-reliance whilst holding a fantasy of perfect care that somewhere out there I could get what I wanted. Maybe if I could just get myself right, I could get the love and the safety and belonging that I had. So into regulation goes, uh, we used to talk, I mean, you'll know, people talk about all the time about attachment theory developed in the 50s and 60s, which now, of course, seems very obvious that, human beings, human infants need attachments, people who are in proximity to them in order to not just be sort of kept warm and fed, but to be safe and to develop. Um, the neuroscientists actually started, Alan Shaw said this actually, said that in a way, maybe we should call attachment theory regulation theory. Let's call it, again, I'm a real believer, let's call things by their proper name. Do you know what's really going on? But holding in mind that the proper name changes as we learn all the time. It's why, I think adoption is not the proper name, it's a cover up. And that was always my first, feeling about it all. But this regulation thing is really, really important. And also, of course, we're fed it. So, any generation that is, well, probably every generation nowadays is who looks on TikTok or Instagram will find someone telling them how to self-regulate perfectly. If you just breathe in a certain way, drink this amount of water, eat this food, don't eat this food, the other food, do this, do that. Do you know? But it goes very wrong because emotional health is relational health,
Mm.
you know. And actually, of course, mental health is about a commitment to reality. So, if reality isn't actually affirmed, recognized, talked about at the beginning of life, like actually you'd have come from somewhere else. And well, there's so much that doesn't get talked about because we're often talking about adopters who are in grief. Then, if mental health is dependent on a commitment to reality, then, mental health is skewed. And then emotional health, if it's relational health, gets really mucked up.
Yeah,
I don't know how we're doing with that answer.
that was great. You've said that healing begins with understanding. What kind of
Yeah.
understanding is crucial for adopted people, their families, and even clinicians that work in this space?
Okay. Well, the term is psychoeducation. And I think that is the beginning of all of this. Let's call it by its proper name. Let's explain it. Let's understand that we're not talking about things we can identify as a rash, but or we take a blood test for, but we're talking about clusters of symptoms that people have in these situations. But there is overwhelming evidence for distress for in early life adversity now. I mean, just in terms of brain development, and it's complicated and it's getting even more so, but it's just there, it just is. And indeed, before birth. Um, so that is there. Can you tell me your question again? I'm
I
sorry.
sure can. That's all right. You've said that healing begins with understanding, and what kind of understanding is crucial for adopted people, families,
Okay.
and clinicians?
Yes. So basically, the psychoeducation. So psychoeducation is de-shaming. It starts to say, look, this is a thing. This happens. This is how it works. You're not the only one. Of course, you feel like this. And by the way, this is so complicated because you can't even recall it. It's so complicated because you didn't have a personality beforehand. So you're likely to have a very accomplished inner critic. Which is going to get in the way of healing. And by the way, your adaptive responses make perfect sense. Of course, you self-regulated. Of course, you withdrew. Of course, you behaved in this way because your nervous system was in a hypervigilance about the catastrophe from the past that was life-threatening could happen again at any point.
Mm,
And actually more and more we talked about the neurons at the beginning of birth and the first sort of 7 years. What happens is most sort of most of the connections, if you like, the synaptic pairings between neurons happen in that time. So that's when we're making the most sense of things. And it's also the time where it's called synaptic pruning. You probably know this as psychologists. Well, I loved it. It's a gardening analogy. Do you know that the things that we don't need get discarded, which is
mhm.
why actually you could really learn any language, if you like, up until the age of 7. But after that, it gets quite sort of difficult. It's why people actually who might lose one sense develop another sense much better. In fact, this is probably quite a good example because, then suddenly, if, if you can't see, then you're going to hear better. The synaptic pruning, the sort of the synapses associated with sight and processing sound, we don't need those. We'll prune them. So that's actually, let's allow for new growth in another sense. Now, think about that with a sense of danger and stuff not making sense. You're talking about synapses wiring together with a sense of, because PTSD is all about the science of safety. It's about what's safe and what isn't safe. And bear in mind for the child, it's about life and death. It's black and white, hence all the binary thinking that goes with PTSD. So there's this development of the synapses, as I don't know who was the first to say it. I think it might be Alan Shaw, but it might not be. That neurons that fire together wire together, those synaptic things. All of the sense we're making is the world is a dangerous place. People who don't have, I mean, nobody has a perfect childhood at all. But people who don't have this enormous threat to life tend to not have lots of synapses to keep them safe. Those are pruned because they're not needed. So they tend to go into life with more of a sort of half full than a half empty.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So you've emphasized the importance of specialized support and understanding in therapeutic settings.
Yeah.
What does
Yeah.
effective therapy look like for adopted people struggling with addiction?
So psychoeducation, I think it involves also teaching people about co-regulation. So I'm a big believer in group therapy. Actually, the most successful intervention really has been around addictions, has been, self-help groups, things like the so-called 12-step programs that exist now that started with Alcoholics Anonymous, and now there are over 50 different self-help groups focusing on, on different issues. And that is, a co-regulation. So in treatment, one of the things you do in residential treatment is really trying to give people a chance to try something that they lost faith in. Let me tell you how I feel, and to realize, or, what I think, and to be heard or to feel regulated. So we're teaching people to co-regulate. It's a second chance. And in a way, individual therapy is like that. But in addiction, the big danger, I think, and it's a big danger in psychotherapy in general, is a dependence on the therapist. There is a need to depend enough to think, oh, I think that Paul has some sort of clue about what he's doing, because then you can feel safe enough to come back for your next appointment. But actually, one of the things that we do, and my colleagues do, is forever, if people are doing homework or, thinking and telling us things, it's like, who could you tell? Could you take the risk of telling someone else what you've told me? If you could, who would it be? You know, and which is an enormous thing for somebody to do,
Mm.
but just trying to desensitize. So recovery is measured by these uncomfortable actions, trying to form more, synaptic links, if you like, around that. So co-regulation, so education, co-regulation, also teaching people about healthy self-regulation. And one of the big issues, one of the things I'm really into is breathing, and lots of people are, and people have been, and people have known it for ages, chanting, singing songs together, the long out breath, the sigh of relief, and helping people understand if you're hypervigilant, you're likely to be a shallow breather. And
Mm.
it's one of the things I often talk about it around smoking. One of the reasons that I think that smoking is so addictive has nothing to do with the nicotine, which actually in itself is quite stimulating, but you can definitely overdose and die on it ultimately. But it's the out-breath. It's smokers. There are two things that happen for smokers. One is, and maybe even more so now, that they have to go out of the office and smoke together on the street. Suddenly there's a co-regulation. We're doing it together. That's quite interesting. But there's also the long out breath, the move from a sympathetic, hyper-aroused state to a parasympathetic. Actually, there's some peace here, sort of state. So we're teaching people to regulate. There are also some interventions, I'm quite interested in things like eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, which we now know doesn't have that much to do with eye movement, actually. I think people wanted to really think that it was, but just sort of techniques for sort of bypassing, you know, the frontal cortex, really. But basically, I think giving people a sense of I can't trust everybody, but I don't have to be compulsively self-reliant. And actually, the fantasy of perfect care is a nonsense. Mummy, I hate to say this, but at some point we have to say, mummy is not coming.
Yeah.
And that's a very, very painful thing for the
Yeah.
for the nervous system.
EMDR is certainly something we keep hearing more about amongst our community and clients that have gone and had some success with EMDR. And certainly the breathing thing, like I've poured probably a lot of my time in the last 11 years to, figuring my own self out. And I think
Right.
the last thing I need to really work on is relaxation because, I have lots of issues with cortisol and how my blood sugar reacts to it, that kind of stuff. So, and breathing, for some reason, meditation is one of the things that I really put off, even though I know it's probably what I need to be doing. Yeah.
I hear that so often. I really get that. And I think that's why back to psychiatric diagnosis, and clusters of symptoms and not being able, they don't have biomarkers. There's an awful lot of people who are diagnosed with attention deficit, ADHD, for example, or ADD, who actually probably really just have it's a complex PTSD. It's not just a difference in the brain. It goes much deeper. Deeper than that. But we are talking about people whose nervous systems are in a hypervigilant state. And actually, if we can, and actually body posture, movement, these things are all important. It's like dance, I think, too. It's not just singing and dancing together. It's very hard to feel in danger when you're opening up your body. It's quite hot and it's very easy to feel in threat if it's closed up.
Yeah.
Again,
Yeah.
why things like yoga, Pilates, these things are all just very good. And if we can persuade our bodies, that actually things are safe, we can persuade our brains. That's what they call bottom up, body to brain, but as well as understanding stuff with the psychoeducation, it hopefully becomes sort of brain to body, top down.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think whether we seek out and use professional support services or not, we do have agency as adopted people in our own healing too. So,
Yeah.
how can we help ourselves?
Well, I think some of the things you've definitely thinking about sort of educating self around this stuff, and there's more and more information out there. And one of the reasons I'm just happy to have a good natter to you, Joe, is because there are people like you who said, look, actually, let's get the info out there.
Yeah.
I often think I should have a book at least to get some sales or something from this. But
We'll
actually, at
buy
the
them. We'll buy your book, Paul.
but at the end of the day, actually, I just prefer to just talk because somehow I'm that sort of person. And I do have to keep my enormous family of consumers, but I do have a clinic and, the other form. But just I think, picking up on the information that's out there, really understanding this business that you have to co-regulate. You can't, if you're just self-regulating, trying to get your breathing right, you're going to go mad because you're going to go down this line of, oh, I've got to breathe for 4 breaths and then this and that, or 5 seconds or hold my breath, or, and you get this orthorexia which is a flight routine. If only I can just get it right, then everything will be okay. And you go bonkers because it's never quite there. Um, so really, again, co-regulation. I think if you can, if there are groups, and I think more and more there are, and we talk about an adoptee community. There is a community, but there's also lots of difference, and doesn't mean everyone's going to get on. It's not adoptees unanimous in any way. There's all sorts of feelings, and some people are really probably a bit too activist,
Yeah.
and they give it a bad name, and other people aren't enough. But having co-regulation, just being able to talk to people, a sense of being understood, um, I think helps. And I think people like, yourself and organizations like Jigsaw can help just get people together to sort of co-create and have this sense of, oh gosh, safety and belonging.
Yeah.
And actually having the impact that you guys have had in Australia, I think we're quite behind. I love what you guys are doing, and looking for apologies, recognition. It's starting to happen around the world. In sort of Scandinavia, and something. But we're still way off. Actually, that may really actually doing something. But we're on a journey.
Yeah.
But by realizing that by people working together, feeling together, not feeling that they've got to have the same thoughts and experiences, but knowing that in general, a bit like addiction, do you know? I mean, a heroin addict can talk to an alcoholic and the feelings will be the same. What they did to get their drugs might be very different.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I always think it's not a one-stop shop. And where things changed for me is I kept wanting someone to fix things for me. And I kept trying to stuff information and stuff, in and expect it just to
Yeah.
heal. Then I started
Yeah.
to realize, no, it's not just one spot. And I actually have to be active and I have agency in this. And I need to be willing to look at more than one thing and find what works and be prepared for the fact that there's no full stop. And you're healed and it's all better. Like it's lifelong issues and you just need to build your toolkit and keep marching down and you get more resilience as you learn more tools to help yourself as you go along. Yeah.
I like that because the danger is it becomes a flight response
Yeah.
to trauma. And flight is when you think about obvious flight animals, things like horses, where, there's a sense of present danger. If I can just get over there, everything will be okay.
Yeah.
And it becomes this, if I can just get this right, it will be okay. But you never actually get there. At some point, the healing is in the feeling. It's another thing. That's the point. The healing's in the feeling. Recovery is measured motivated by uncomfortable actions. We have to be just, pushing ourselves in all areas of personal growth to do something that actually is, if it's uncomfortable within a window of tolerance,
Mm.
then we can start to make changes over time. But we also have to bear in mind that these early years of life, and it's not just the whole idea of loss, it's also what happens in adoptive family. And there's a whole range of experiences, that happen there. And there's some terrible abuses and very high incidence of sort of suicide because people are feeling, really what's the point? I'm so so misunderstood.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'd hate to take a survey of my loved ones and what it's like to have been around me and supported me through my whole life, and whether I might not like to hear what they have to say. But I'm wondering what you can tell us about the role of adoptive parents, biological parents, and loved ones in supporting adopted people, particularly around addiction.
Well, I think each of those three groups really are deserving of real support. And I think biological parents and particularly biological mothers have had an enormous wound, and I'm sure you see that. I certainly do, and people will say, not a day goes by, something very, very, anti-biology has happened. Usually, nearly always forcibly, not always, but nearly always. And it's an enormous wound. And um, I said birth parents and birth mothers, but perhaps in particular, again, need some support and maybe, again, some psychoeducation about the cultural context in which a lot of these things happened, that it wasn't okay, too. Adopted parents, I think the problem with the word adoption, I mean, maybe it's not, it's come to I prefer things like sort of legal guardianship now, and that's what I hear. There's something about adoption, and the word itself doesn't say it, that can sort of imply sort of ownership, or
Mm.
as if you adopt somebody in and they are genuinely fully part of. Because actually, I haven't met an adopted person that feels part of. It's part that, if you like, is part of the problem. I don't belong here, and I don't belong there in
Yeah,
many ways. So I think so much of this is about education, and for some adoptive parents, particularly those that are managing a wound and feeling that somehow, a replacement might be helpful, a replacement for the hope that I had, or maybe the loss that I had. You know, there's there's an awful lot of support needed, but there's no doubt there are babies who need legal guardianship and
yeah.
deserve that. I mean, one of the problems with it, with actually, I think a lot of the adoptions is the United Nations Charter for the Rights of Children are contravened. If you have a look, you
They
know,
certainly are. Thank you for
it-
saying that. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, absolutely.
and in many, that's another talk,
Yeah,
you know, in many of the articles,
yeah,
you know.
yeah. So, how can professionals working with adoptees, so counselors, therapists, social workers, better understand and respond to the unique needs of people of adopted people?
Again, it's psychoeducation. Sorry to keep using this term.
Oh, it's
We just need to talk about it and understand, that thing. I've often repeated it. I think it's a Chinese proverb. I tend to say it is. I don't know otherwise where it comes from, but the beginning of wisdom is to call something by its proper name. Let's do that. Let's know that names change too, particularly in this world where there can be an awful lot of sort of flight response. We just got to get the right name, or if today's name is wrong, we need next week's. And certainly last week's name was very wrong for it all. But to understand we're in a process. But so let's understand we're in a process, but let's call it by its proper name. Let's really think about it. Let's take in all that we know about neuroscience, and the development of the brain, and this the science of safety, because that is what this is about. This is about the art and science of safety. For you, Joe, it's like what felt safe and what didn't. And
Mm.
this is why binary thinking is one of the symptoms of complex PTSD, black and white. Because, for the infant, or actually anybody being traumatized, it's life and death. Someone comes at you with a knife, you don't factor in if you live or you die, you don't factor in a few cuts. It's
Yeah.
black and it's white. And for the infant, I live or I die, do you know? So anyway, just this stuff, it's just really important for us to understand this.
Yeah.
stuff.
Thank you. So if you could share just one message with adopted people struggling with addiction of any kind, what would it be?
Um, you can recover, but you can't do it on your own. And that's both a good thing and a frightening thing, because actually not doing it on your own goes against everything that you've learned. At some point, your addiction made sense to you. It was an adaptive response to what I suggest was a traumatic stress. The problem is that you actually, this is another symptom of CPTSD, re-traumatized yourself, because if trauma is captivity and powerlessness, I'm afraid so is addiction. You are captive to it and you've been powerless. You're going to need to risk telling somebody who you are and how you feel. But that is possible.
Yeah.
And we see it all the time. And that's why, it's a great field to work in, because people who want to get better can get better. And they have more chance now because we understand more.
Thank you.
That's
Paul, thank
probably
you
more
so
than one thing.
much. Oh, look, that was so amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know you're a very busy man and your insights are invaluable, and we truly appreciate your time, expertise, and dedication to the adoption community. And thank you for answering our email when we reached out to you, because it took us quite a while to find out how to reach out to you. And we're just thrilled that you came on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm happy to do it. And just, for the record, we started at 7 a.m. in the morning here in the UK.
4 p.m. for me. Much better for
I
me.
am in exactly. So, I am in clinic then. So hopefully that's a measure of how important I think this, I view this stuff to be. But I've enjoyed meeting you, Joe. It's been really stimulating, the conversations that we've had.
Excellent. Yeah. And if you get to Australia, I hope we can catch up and do something with you. So please let us know if you're coming over.
Yeah, no, that would be it. I would love that.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
And
Yeah.
to our listeners, we hope today's episode has provided a deeper understanding of the adoption experience and its impact with addiction. So remember, every adoption journey is unique and it's never too late to begin exploring your own story. And Jigsaw Queensland's here to support you. And if you'd like to support the podcast, please leave us a review, share episodes, or get in touch because we'd love to hear from you. And if you've got a story that you'd like to share, we invite you to apply to be a guest on the podcast. Just visit the main podcast page on the Jigsaw Queensland website and complete the prospective guest form. And just remember that Adopt Perspective can be and is listened to by people all over the world. Thank you for listening, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Adopt Perspective podcast. If you'd like to find out more, go to the podcast page on www.jigsawqueensland.com and you'll find a wealth of information and resources on the website. If you reside in Queensland, you can reach Jigsaw Queensland's Forced Adoption Support Service on toll-free 1800 210313, or you can call Jigsaw on 07 33 58 6666. If you live in another state of Australia, you can still call the Forced Adoption Support Service number and your call will be answered by the Forced Adoption Support Service in the state that you're calling from. In every other state, Relationships Australia operates this service. A big thank you to Matt Sparrow for composing and recording our original theme music. Until next time, I'm Jo Sparrow saying farewell from Adopt Perspective, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption.